A few years ago, EVs looked like they were going to be the way of the future. They were fast, powerful cars that could also help save the planet. Yet media headlines in 2024 and 2025 have been screaming about a slumping EV industry, with CNBC even announcing EV euphoria is dead. In 2023, Ford postponed $12 billion of their planned EV production. GM expected to produce between 200,000 to 250,000 EVs in 2024, down from the initial estimate of 400,000. And Volkswagen canceled the development of a $2 billion EV factory in Germany. So what happened? How did a once promising market end up going so wrong? The answers may surprise you and disprove a lot of the popular myths about electric vehicles. On today's episode of the Infographic Show, we're revealing the real reason why EV cars are on the decline. Another 15 years with your beloved car, and you decide it's time for an upgrade. You want something modern, packed with cutting-edge tech. But hey, why not make it good for the environment too? So you head to your nearest car dealer to buy an electric vehicle. The salesman greets you and takes you around the showroom. He rattles off about how great the newest line of EVs are, how much money you'll save on gas, and how helpful your new car choice will be for the environment. You smile and you nod along as you take a closer look at the price, and it starts at $45,000. For a car? Your stomach drops. You start doing the mental math. Maybe it's time to check how much kidneys go for on the dark web. You quickly interrupt the salesman and you explain that actually you're after a more budget-friendly car. The salesman pauses and explains, this is their most budget-friendly car. Shocked, you start looking around the showroom at other options. You spot another model with a base price of $80,000? Maybe a truck instead? But the truck starts at $80,000 as well. Next to it's an SUV with a starting price of $85,000. And that's without any bells and whistles that you'd like to add on. How are you supposed to afford any of this? Well, that's the first problem with the EV market today. The first electric vehicles that were introduced were targeted to luxury consumers, as most new car tech is. As the technology is still being refined and developed, producing an EV is still more expensive than producing a gas-powered car. This is mostly because of the lithium-ion battery that powers them, which often amounts to 78% of the car's total price. According to Kelley Blue Book, in June 2024, the average new electric vehicle cost $56,000, while the average new gas-powered vehicle cost $49,000. While $7,000 might not seem like a huge difference, it's still enough to make most buyers think twice before committing to an EV. Unfortunately for electric vehicles, the price gap is most noticeable in the compact SUV category, which happens to be one of the most popular categories in the US market. According to Edmunds.com, the average electric compact SUV costs $53,048, while a gas-powered version sits at just $35,722, a 58.5% price difference. With inflation driving up costs across the board, consumers are watching their wallets more carefully than ever. And for most, the extra cost of an EV simply isn't worth it. Many manufacturers as well as auto experts make the argument that over time, EVs end up paying for themselves because of the lower fueling and maintenance costs. After all, EVs don't need oil changes, spark plug replacements, or checks on the exhaust system, mainly because they don't have any of those things. The battery and the motor also require way less maintenance than a gas-powered car would require. Car and Driver magazine put this to the test by comparing two popular models, the Hyundai Kona versus the Hyundai Kona Electric, and the Ford F-150 versus the Ford F-150 Lightning. They analyzed both initial purchase prices and operating costs over the first 3 years of ownership to see if the EVs truly offer long-term savings. They found that over the period of 3 years, the Hyundai Kona cost almost $19,400 in total terms of fueling, maintenance, and depreciation costs. Meanwhile, the electric version cost $21,400, making the electric option more expensive. However, the Ford F-150 costs totaled $26,200, while the electric version only cost $23,800. That being said, neither of those numbers take into account one of the main reasons people started buying up EVs in the first place: the tax credit, meant to incentivize electric vehicle sales. With the credit calculated into the costs of the cars, it's clear that the EVs are winners in terms of lower costs. But what happens if the tax credit goes away? Well, that brings us to our next problem. As you're still recovering from the sticker shock, the salesman seizes the moment. He leans in with a reassuring smile and says that you can always use the tax credit the US government offers to bring the cost down. It's $7,500 for an eligible new model, the salesman responds, and you can even get $4,000 for eligible used models now. With that much money back, you could probably afford the least expensive car on the lot. Things are starting to look up. The salesman continues, but you should purchase soon because the tax credit may not be around for that much longer if you're eligible for it. How are you supposed to know if a car actually qualifies? And why could waiting just a month mean you end up with no tax credit at all? This brings us to one of the biggest issues causing the EV market to slow today: a hazy political future of EVs. Every time a new party comes to power, any tax credits or incentives for electric vehicles might be in danger. Administrations can sign executive orders reversing previous targets for electric vehicle sales and repeal EV tax credits. Since the EV market is still in its early stages, prices remain higher than gas-powered vehicles, and not just because of the expensive batteries. A huge portion of the cost comes from ongoing research and development as automakers continue to refine and improve the relatively new technology. Until those costs balance out, EVs will likely stay more expensive than their gas-powered counterparts for at least a few more years. If the tax credit disappears, EVs will become less competitive in the US auto market, affecting both how much manufacturers want to produce them and how likely consumers are to buy them. But there are reasons to be optimistic. Market research firm Gartner says that battery EVs and their manufacturing methods are advancing so fast they will actually be cheaper to produce than an internal combustion engine of similar type by 2027. But in the meantime, the possibility of tax credits and other financial incentives disappearing makes people wary of buying EVs. And that's not just a US-only phenomenon. Europe and Australia have also been pulling back on incentives as well. Australian states like Victoria, New South Wales, and South Australia ended their $3,000 rebates in 2023 and 2024. In perhaps not a coincidence, in April 2024, electric vehicle sales dropped for the first time in 2 years. But you also have to qualify for the tax credits in the first place. In the US, the manufacturer's suggested retail price, MSRP, of the EV you're buying has to be under certain limits: $80,000 for SUVs and larger vehicles, $55,000 for sedans. It also has to be assembled in North America, with a battery that is at least 50% assembled in North America. The consumers will also have to meet certain income requirements, less than $300,000 in adjusted gross income per household. All of this isn't common knowledge yet, since EVs are new, and the instability of potential credits makes consumers hesitant to invest in one. Not to mention where a consumer lives can also make a big difference for two reasons. Back to the car dealership, where you're deciding that you might as well get an EV, but soon so you can take advantage of the tax credit while it's still around. The salesman then asks if you live in the area, California, or are you planning to move soon. He lets you know that California is actually one of the most EV-friendly places to live. You say you might actually be moving back to Mississippi soon. The salesman pauses, his smile disappearing, as he watches his commission check vanish into thin air. Maybe an EV isn't such a good idea after all, he says. And that is one of the other major issues slowing down EV adoption. Where you live can make all the difference, and not just because of infrastructure and available chargers. There can be a lot of hidden costs. Mississippi, for example, is rated the least EV-friendly place in the US, while California, unsurprisingly, is rated the most. The difference between the two in EV infrastructure is huge. California has almost 51,500 chargers in total. Mississippi has 419. And depending on where in the state you find yourself, there might not be a charger near you at all. Not that you'll need one as often as you think, but we'll get back to that later. In the meantime, where you live also affects how much it costs to charge up your EV. US residents pay very different amounts for electricity depending on where in the country they are, and how greedy their local energy monopoly is. In 2020, for example, Louisiana residents paid an average of 10 cents per kilowatt hour. Residents in Hawaii paid 33 cents per kilowatt hour, 3.3 times more expensive than Louisiana. So it makes a lot of sense that consumers in some states see little point in buying EVs. As you're trying to decide whether the new car is really worth the price, you spot a Toyota dealership across the street. Maybe you should compare prices with the mostly gas-powered vehicles there instead. So when the salesman gets called into his office by a coworker, you sneak out to see what's happening over at Toyota. The prices do seem more reasonable here, but you look around and notice something else. There is not a lot of people in the showroom. In fact, it's mostly just salesmen standing around looking bored. That's exactly like the scene you left behind in the EV dealership across the street. Perhaps it's not just EV cars on the decline. Why does it seem like no one is buying cars in general? In 2 words, interest rates. During the COVID pandemic, inflation swept across the world due to a number of factors. One was the government spending needed to keep people afloat, as many lost their jobs or customer base and needed assistance. There were also programs to help those whose lives got upended or who got incredibly ill during the pandemic. And the second factor was There were also programs to help those whose lives got upended or who got incredibly ill during the pandemic. The second important factor was supply chain disruptions that caused supply of almost everything to go down. Higher demand due to extra money in the economy, coupled with lower supply, led to inflation. Traditionally, to combat inflation, central banks increase interest rates to make borrowing and therefore some purchasing harder. Inflation is the result of an overheated economy. Slowing down economic activity a little is usually what gets it under control. Unfortunately, higher interest rates hit some businesses, like the auto industry, really hard. Most people buy cars with installments paid over several months. Higher interest rates meant that car consumers need to pay more for each installment, so they couldn't afford as expensive a car as they would have liked to been able to before interest rates rose. New car sales slumped from 74.9 million in 2019 to 63.8 million in 2020. Even as lockdowns eased up and people got back to the road, high interest rates kept recovery slow. Sales just barely passed pre-COVID levels in 2023, with 75.3 million vehicles sold, and the rebound is still slow going. While all car manufacturers are affected by the new rates, EV makers were the most affected, thanks to their already higher prices. This wasn't helped by the fact that EV manufacturers disproportionately make luxury models. In the first quarter of 2024, nearly 266,000 EVs were sold in the US. 72% of those had either luxury or premium trims. That also makes EVs in general unappealing to the working and middle class. Back to the car dealership. Toyota was a bust, so you're back in the EV showroom and you're waiting for the salesman to reappear. As you're waiting, you look up at the news and you see that a Tesla fire has created a lane closure on a nearby highway. The reporter goes on to say that there's a recall for Tesla Cybertrucks because the cover on the accelerator pedal was slipping off and getting stuck in the interior trim. This led to the truck accelerating dangerously with no easy way to stop it. Something it seems Tesla should have looked into before selling their cars. Now you are really rethinking buying an EV. Tesla is by far the most recognizable EV brand, one of the first companies to make electric cars in the first place. If they're having problems, maybe EV companies in general aren't doing so well. Besides, you've got a long commute, which means your car needs to have a long range. And isn't that always a problem with electric vehicles? Not to mention, the whole catching fire thing is slightly concerning. You know what? You just realize this is way too much trouble and you just don't care to deal with it. You walk out of the showroom and decide to stick with your old car for another year. The misinformation about electric vehicles, coupled with some misinformation when they were first introduced, has made them unappealing for a lot of consumers. And their politicization has now made them even more unappealing. Yes, in our current times, even whether or not you buy an electric vehicle has become a politicized decision, but we'll get to that soon. First up, the repeated misinformation. Former Top Gear host Jeremy Clarkson once wrote an article titled, "Electric Vehicles Can Explode. Petrol ones only do it in movies." He listed a lot of the issues he believed EVs have. Number one being that they are dangerous. Reports of Teslas catching fire on highways across the US have also supported the idea that electric vehicles are not safe to drive, turning potential buyers off. But is that really the case? Norway, a big adopter of EVs, 26% of the country's cars are now fully electric, released data on engine fires. It showed gas-powered vehicles in the country caught fire 5 or 6 times more frequently than EVs. The National Transportation Safety Board in the US backs up this finding with even more data. It found that for every 100,000 EVs sold, 25 were involved in fires. For every 100,000 gas-powered vehicles sold, over 1,500 caught on fire. Hybrid cars fared the worst, with almost 3,500 catching on fire out of every 100,000. Now, we can all agree that a car catching on fire while you're in it is generally a bad thing. But it seems like your old Toyota Corolla is much more likely to flambe you than a new Tesla. But as electric vehicles dominate the headlines and the nation's attention, media outlets are much more likely to report on EV fires rather than regular old gas-powered car fires. Also, because one brand in particular, Tesla, is in the news a lot now. Which brings us back to the politicization of EVs and how that affects car sales. Green energy has become a highly politicized issue, creating a clear divide. Liberal parties generally tend to support it, whereas conservative parties are more cautious or outright oppose it, favoring traditional fossil fuels instead. One poll in 2024 found that when asked about electric car brands, GOP voters gave them a net 40% unfavorable rating. Democrats gave them a net 15% favorable rating, a 55-point difference, which is absolutely huge. Similarly, in 2024, Pew Research Center found that 70% of Republicans were not likely to consider purchasing an EV as their next car. while 56% of Democrats were considering it. With Elon Musk's foray into politics, Tesla is facing a backlash from many Democrats and international buyers. And since, as of January 2025 at least, Tesla had a 44% market share for U.S. electric vehicles, and this slump in Tesla sales is significant for the market as a whole. Tesla sales have declined a whopping 76% in Germany compared to that same time last year. According to EV outlet Electric, in Europe as a whole, deliveries dropped by 70% in early 2025 compared to the beginning of 2024. Meanwhile, the European Automobile Manufacturers Association, ACEA, reported that Tesla vehicle registrations in the EU fell by 45% from January 2024 to January 2025. The extreme divide and politicization over EVs, particularly the Tesla brand, has made a lot of people more reluctant to consider buying one. That's amplified by anxieties and misconceptions people have about EVs, as people tend to have with any new technology that makes them less likely to buy one. For example, Recurrent Auto surveyed more than 250 people and found that 76% of potential EV owners worry about the range of their car. Meanwhile, 59% of actual EV drivers don't have any worries about it at all. In fact, 78% of EV drivers said that their initial range anxiety faded over time as they gained experience and realized it wasn't really an issue. So why do anxieties and misconceptions about the range of EV cars persist? Possibly because when the very first models were introduced to markets, they did have a very limited range. According to International Energy Agency reports, the average range of electric vehicles in 2010 was just under 80 miles. In 2021, the average range had gone up to 220. It almost tripled in just over a decade. Today, models like the Tesla S have a range of 320 miles, while the EV Chevy Silverado reaches up to 400 miles, rivaling most gas-powered vehicles. Considering the average American drives only 37 miles a day, modern EV models are more than capable of handling daily commutes and even road trips. After all, 320 miles covers the entire width of Nevada. But first impressions stick, and for many potential buyers, EVs still have a reputation problem. Until more people experience driving EVs firsthand and they realize that the fears don't match reality, consumer hesitation will continue, slowing EV growth. Many of the early adopters who were eager to switch have already bought one, leaving a market that is harder to convince. Which brings us to one more optimistic point. Are EV cars actually on the decline, as many media headlines have claimed? Or is there something else going on? Though CNN may publish articles with titles like "How EVs Became Such a Massive Disappointment" and "Barron Predicts EV Sales Will Tumble in 2025," a closer look at the data makes it obvious that's not exactly what's happening. The growth of EV sales has slowed, but in most parts of the world it's still on the rise. The actual problem is that many car companies expected EV sales to skyrocket exponentially in the next few years. They now find themselves with way more EVs on their hands than they can sell. Basically, car companies just got too optimistic. Not to mention, the initial successes of EVs attracted a lot more competitors in the market. This means individual companies are now experiencing downward price and demand pressures because of much more competition. Car companies are sitting around with larger EV inventories than ever. Cox Automotive said that at the end of 2023, the total number of unsold new EVs in the U.S. reached 2.6 million units, up 57% from the end of 2022. But those same companies are also selling record-breaking amounts of them. According to Kelley Blue Book, in the second quarter of 2024, EV sales in the U.S. grew by 11.3%, with over 330,000 units sold, compared to the year before. Bloomberg NEF estimated that EV sales in 2024 would total 16.7 million units, up from 13.9 million the previous year. And it turns out they actually underestimated how well EVs ended up doing, as 17.1 million units were sold that year. Even in the handful of countries where sales actually declined, the numbers are somewhat distorted. For example, Germany saw a 69% sudden drop in EV sales in August of 2024, causing some market observers to panic. But those who took a closer look pointed out that the EV sales had actually been really uncharacteristically high in August the year before, because one of the major EV subsidies in Germany was about to be cut. So anyone who was planning to buy an EV in the next few months bought one in August, making sales figures the next year seem lower in comparison than they actually were. However, the fact still remains that the rate of growth of EV sales is slowing. By 2023, electric cars saw a 50% growth year over year, and by 2024 that number had dropped to 20%. Of course, as more people buy electric vehicles, it makes sense that the rate of growth can't be what it once was. When only 1,000 people had electric vehicles, 2,000 cars sold the next year would have been 100% growth. But now that 7% of the US owns an EV, with about 2.5 million such cars on the road, it makes it harder to sustain those percentages. The biggest challenge facing EV markets now is getting mainstream buyers to purchase their cars. And with uncertainty around tax incentives, high prices, misinformation about safety and range, and the politicization of major EV companies, many potential buyers are hesitant or avoiding EVs altogether. A Gallup poll in March of 2024 found that only 44% of adults might consider buying an EV in the future, compared to 55% in 2023. And the number of people who said they will definitely not buy one rose from 41% to 48%. EV companies must convince people to change their minds to accelerate growth rates once again. If they can't, then the road ahead looks tough. Are EVs really declining, or is this just a temporary slump? What do you think is the biggest reason people are hesitating to buy electric cars? Price, range, politics, or something else? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Now go check out the real reason Starbucks is failing, or click on this video instead.